to be honest, I was sitting there taking notes. I mean, I couldn't keep up. One thing just to comment before we open it for questions, I just wanted to make a comment. One thing that impressed me about both of these are two completely different kind of presentations, which I thought was excellent. Two different kinds of companies, two different industries. I actually love David's comment about the fact that he doesn't even know what IEC 62443 is. Mark,
I'll know about Amara, no problem.
No. Yeah, but I think that's a very important point. It was one of the points I tried to make yesterday when we had the session on infrastructure was everybody thinks, well, that's just the same thing, and it isn't, clearly. Because I know you're a smart guy, and so if it was relevant, you'd know it, and vice versa, I suspect. You have no idea what he's talking about with some of this
Yeah,
stuff.
I'm not as familiar with that one you mentioned.
Right. But the other thing that really impressed me, just a comment, was when in Mark's presentation, I talk to lots of people, lots of plants, and they have challenges, and you see my little pitch all the time about the resource issues and things like that. And I'm looking at it almost from a plant perspective. An individual plant doesn't have enough people. But then when I hear you talk about Shell and what you need with policies, governance, things like that, to set these standards, because it's such a large company, the issues are enormous. And so one thing we saw a couple years ago, Tyler Williams gave some presentations here. He did it 2 years actually in a row about Shell, and it was around the technology, as Mark said. And he made a point that he just simplified it down. And I actually made a note here. One thing I found really interesting was, it may not be accurate, but I get the impression Shell's almost a technology follower. Not because you don't want to secure stuff, not that you're afraid of new technology, just that how do you manage this use of new technologies when you have such an enormous organization? On the other hand, the other thing I really thought was a fantastic, and we didn't plan this or anything, was I would say Duke is right, a technology grasper. I mean, you're just looking for technology. And maybe it's because the issues are different. You're trying to deal with, you're dealing with kind of traditional facilities.
Yeah.
You're dealing with a whole new challenges from distribution. So anyhow, just making my own comments. Personally, I thought these were two fantastic presentations because of the diversity, the complexity that comes out of it and things like that. So with that said, I had made some questions, but I'd just as soon open it to you all.
Yeah, well, I would just comment that you're right. I would characterize what we're doing as basic blocking and tackling, but we have to do it across a gigantic landscape. So that's our challenge. And then we want to incrementally add in those better technologies. But again, yes.
Without losing control of the stuff
Right.
that you're trying to do.
Right.
And then I thought the other thing that was very interesting, and I think Duke probably has the same thing. I happen to come from I didn't work for an EPC, but I come from the steel industry, and I was involved in building plants. Much more, I didn't work for the end user. We built plants. And that project side, to throw that in on top of the fact that you're trying to get control of what you have, and all of a sudden now you keep building new ones, it's a very, very big challenge. So,
I think I have one comment. Am I still mic'd? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm amazed at how many requirements we have. Well, requirements or standards. Yeah, I've read all these I thought I'd read all the standards that I needed to read to understand that they all do this beautiful job, most of them, of requirements, of things that you have to do. But I see no best practice. I'm waiting for somebody to step up and go, this is best practice.
They're out there. Yeah.
There are? Well, maybe you've done it in Shell. I tell you, to go down to the letter of the law of like this this IEC 62351 thing that says, here's how you do PKI-9. Nobody's done that in our space. You have that to edge devices in the control
No, I'm
system
just
world.
saying that like NIST has a pretty good set of best practices. I think they do have. Maybe, I'll do my lifeline to Michael. Maybe some best practices around how they do digital
I mean real implementation. I don't just mean a control that matches a requirement. This point drives me nuts.
I was just going to say there are reference implementations from like ICS CERT and those folks, but to what you were saying, that there's not been a consortium coming out and saying this is how we've done it in the different assets and so forth. So
I mean, the goal of our group is to put together, to understand the issues, understand the gaps, look at what requirements are not met, but then to drive it a little bit further and to say what is the procurement language that needs to be. If you just say do NIST 7628, well, I'm not sure what that means. It's so broad and so wide. You know, I mean, we really need something that lays it out in more detail. And then they'll come, I mean, the vendors would have to push back. I was a vendor most of my life. You push back and go, well, that's going to cost a fortune. And then in the end, are you going to end up with an open system, or is it going to be locked in proprietary to their vendor? I think it's complicated, you know. But I'd like to see more unison between the different groups. You know, this is,
Yeah, but you're right. I agree with you in the sense that, are we doing digital certificate management for any of our automation kit? I'm not aware of a single instance across.
No, we've
Because
been,
it's so
that's something
hard.
on our radar for sure, to do PKI, but we're not doing
Yeah,
it.
because it's so hard.
Any
or
questions?
at least
from the
somebody
floor?
say they're
Please,
doing
back there,
PKI
Larry.
to the gateway. You know, and then they put a fence around everything. I'd like to hear that even. That'd be good.
Hi, this is Samir from Covestro. Mark, hearing you talk about the projects and smaller and large site differences, enforcing compliance to the larger sites versus smaller sites has been always a challenge, and you addressed that a little bit. I would like to know a little bit more about how do you really find out or define the controls that are really enforceable versus optional for smaller sites versus, I mean, it's definitely based on the risks. However, it's always a challenge to find out the right balance. How did you tackle that, or it's still work in progress, how you tackle that issue at the sites? Because it always comes down to the fact that how much is enough, how much is really required, and then smaller sites probably having less of a manpower also, that becomes a challenge over there.
Yeah, that's a good question, because that's what we're about to embark upon, is figuring that out. Because up until now, our standard has been a minimum standard. So it's been a minimum standard that every site has to implement. And we didn't have the concept of a recommended practice internally until I mentioned this new rollout of this new business management system. But now we do. The philosophy with the new business management system is that we have a minimum, even a minimaler minimum standard, smaller number of requirements, and we have a pretty good laundry list of best practices. And so it will be up to the sites, and then, so it'll be up to the sites to figure out which of those best practices they implement. But how do they figure it out? What methodology do you use to say, I'm gonna do 10 out of the 20, or 15 out of the 20? Well, that's what I mentioned earlier. So that's something that we've got to figure out, how to turn the crank on risk assessment at the site level, because in the past, we've just turned the crank once for Shell globally, and then it's just been that minimum standard. And then within projects, probably additional issue, because you would probably have to say, for the project going into this business, you know, you need to align with what that business, or that, you know, wherever that site's going, where that project is going, what is their risk profile going to be, and then you build the project to that risk profile. Mm-hmm. So that's an additional complication, and we really haven't crossed that bridge yet, to be honest. But that's something we have to work on.
Do you have a problem, just, I don't want to, I know there's questions there, but just to follow up, because it's something, a pet thing with me is, when you say this is what we expect on the new projects, do the project managers actually enforce that? I mean, I've been too many times involved when you, particularly with project managers who are driven by costs and deliveries, and they go to some supplier and say this is our requirements, and he says, I can't do that, or so they trade it off. I don't know if you suffer with that or how you manage that.
Well, the key is that person that I mentioned, right? That PC integrity project focal point. And the problem is that if you get him in too late, then, you know, contracts and POs are already cut, and then it's really hard, if not impossible, to make a change. So the key is getting that resource into the project early enough to where they can work those interfaces, you know, work with the business to say, what do you need? There's a collaboration, an iterative collaboration effort there to figure out what we need, and do it early enough to where we can get the, you know, the design in place, the POs, before the project's too far down the road and spending money. Because they're not going to change. It's very difficult to get a change order once they start cutting all the POs.
It's even hard just to get it into the PO, I'm sure.
Right,
Yeah.
right.
I'm sorry, go ahead. Yes, please.
Yeah, this is more for David, I think, but you mentioned, you know, about device identity, PKI, whitelisting, encrypted payloads, and transport encryption and such as a key requirement. And I'm curious, have you or has anybody here heard of the host identity protocol and its role in serving as that type of function? Is that an exploration that your team is looking at, or the open standard? I don't know if you've.
I've heard about it, but I don't know the details. We
Okay.
are not exploring it. Can you provide some detail?
Well, it was ratified by the IETF in April of 2015, and its whole principle is to solve the problem, the fundamental TCP/IP problem of separating the IP address from serving the dual purpose function of location and identity. And unfortunately, in traditional IT methods, that problem, using an IP address as a base enforcement identifier, doesn't work, especially in the industrial IoT world, where machines, there's no user invocation of a connection. And it authenticates and authorizes connections before TCP session establishment. So nothing can be discovered or found unless it has the correct cryptographic identity that's based upon a whitelist. So it's something that people should, I'd recommend, look at. And it's partly because I too get frustrated when NIST's cybersecurity framework is actually very, very good, but when they talk, it's always about you should have cryptographic identity for the devices, but it's never the how. You know, and that's so I hear your point, and I agree with you. To have those implementation guides would be really, really beneficial.
You know, just to comment on that, you know, Eric Cosman, who works with us, I don't know how many of you know Eric, but he's one of the chairs of the ISA 99 committee. But that's one of their main focus areas, is to develop use cases. He's made that point. He makes it over and over and over. So that is one of their focus issues. Now, what he means by use case, or best practices and use cases and examples, I don't know how deep it goes.
Yeah, I think ARC actually released a paper that had software-defined networking and hosted identity protocol in a paper, and that's how I learned about it.
From an ARC?
Yes.
One of Eric's?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, I didn't write it, so it must have been Eric.
If I might, just really quickly to add a bit to that, HIP is a protocol that is in use, you know, in your industry, on the upstream side, and I'm happy to, Mark, I can tell you offline who it is, et cetera. A lot of work was done on it at Boeing about 10 years ago, so it's got a bit of a pedigree. If you think about it, it's kind of the obvious way you would use two-factor, or you use PKI, well, public-private crypto, to do authentication of endpoints, and it has a challenge because it's difficult to manage at scale, but I think it's a pretty interesting approach worth taking a look at. I mean, PKI is challenging for its reasons, and they're kind of built into it as well. You know, HAP may provide a way to alleviate some of them.
Yeah, it's something that I think actually Michael came close to arranging for a test with Tempered Networks on that, but we haven't yet. But I think that's something that probably should be close to the top of the list, to see, you know, how it can be used. And I think it's neat because once it's set up, it's kind of an orchestrated solution to set it up, but that orchestrator is not required to be online for it to actually operate, unlike software-defined networking. If that orchestrator goes down, you know, you got a problem. So, yeah, so that's something that I think is certainly worth looking into.
So yeah, one of the things we sort of look at is that we tend to not be super excited maybe about you know, a global host that we have to register with or enroll with, sort of thing. So we're really looking at how can we distribute that through certificates sort of stuff. So we're looking at a distributed version of that. So thank you very much for this host identity protocol thing. We'll dive into it.
You know, there's a lot of suppliers a lot of companies have that issue. They don't want to have the certificates outside their company, let alone globally.
Oh,
Even
well,
outside
definitely.
your
No,
company.
there'll definitely be
You
due
want your own
certs for the control system side, but I think we even want to push it out to how far does that cert reach. And for example, if you're doing Flizzr, if you're way out at the grid edge and the self-healing grid and the grid reforms, does the IT part reform? Do they get a new set of certificates, or do they have two sets? Are they generated at the substation level, or is it just from some global guy in the sky, you know? The networks are so choppy that you don't want to really be dependent, I think, on an edge device or function, have to reach to the global guy all the time sort of thing, So we're given the luxury of trying to figure out what this will be in the future and not driven operationally.
Hello, Dave Bennett, Phillips 66. Two good presentations. I appreciate the effort. But this is to Mark. You talked about your standards being smaller, and then you also talked about more responsibility at the site, pushing more responsibility to the site. Did you make the standards smaller so that while you were pushing the responsibility to the sites, and if so, and the second part of that question is, wouldn't that make them have the ability to slide the implementation of those, because they're now can make decisions at the site where they want to put their money, right?
Yes.
So.
Yeah, so the whole philosophy of this new business management system is that the site owns the risk, and it wasn't just the PCD integrity process that has a sort of skinny standard, meaning the mandatory part. All of the other processes under this system has a skinny standard, but there's a robust set of recommended practices, however. And so the intent is to give the site, because it's recognized that each site has a different risk profile, not just cybersecurity risk, but HSSE risk profile. And so you want to give, and it's also trying to be more competitive, right, in this low-cost environment with oil and gas. Give the site the ability to make risk-based decisions, do the minimum standard, which is skinnier now than it was, but then pick the recommended practices that mitigate their particular risk. Now, so how do you make sure that they're making the right decisions? Well, there are KPIs around this. I didn't get into the KPIs, but there are KPIs around their performance for each process, including this managed PCD integrity process, has KPIs. And so how they perform against that is taken care of by the assurance model, right? So in theory, it should work out. Now, it's going to be a journey, right? It's a change. It's probably going to be a journey. We'll have to check and adjust along the way. But the whole premise is to give the site the ability to implement the right level of controls, meaning spending the right level of money.
Okay, we've run out of time, but I'm sure these guys would love to talk to you if you have any questions. And thank you so much. Please join me in applauding them, because those were excellent presentations.